Hi, everybody. I'm Ramiro Calderon. I'm a product manager in the Entra team. We're very excited to come here and a new edition of this talk about attacking and defending Entra. So we did that a couple of years back with my friend Mark. And today I'm joined with my friend John.
I'm John Flores. I'm a senior content developer at Microsoft. I focus on identity solutions, conditional access, ID protection, device identities, a little bit of the zero trust story. I'm a recovering IT pro.
Right on. Cool.
So we're going to start off today with our scary stats slide. We know that the Microsoft Digital Defense Report just came out a few weeks ago. If you're not familiar, it's a great place to gather some stats about what we're seeing in the industry right now based on the data that we collect. We're collecting 78 trillion, with a T, security signals every day to power those insights. We see 600 million attacks per day against Microsoft customers. 64 million abusive attacks or accounts that we got rid of in 2023. And the stat that I want to bring your attention to on the slide here, 7,000 password attacks blocked per second. 7,000 per second password attacks. The one that kind of concerns me a little bit is that one at the bottom. So in 2022, 37% of monthly active users signed in with MFA, and 2 years later, that number's only gone up to 41%. We know that 99% of attacks involve passwords in some way, shape, or form, and those insecure MFA methods. We're going to talk about that here in a second. There are things that you can do. These identity attacks are continuously getting worse and worse. So we're going to cover a few of those things that we think you should go do to protect yourselves, or those of you who are on the other side of the fence, what you can do to take advantage of insecure configurations. So we've got three main areas we're going to cover. We're going to talk about protecting your credentials. Ramiro is going to talk about protecting applications, and then we're going to split up external access, and we're going to talk about that a little bit, along with give you some go-dos, things that you might want to do. So we talked about one of those attacks. Let's drill into one of them. So this is an adversary in the middle attack, sometimes also called attacker in the middle. You know it's an attacker because he has a really evil mustache on his face. So this attacker can build infrastructure or rent that infrastructure. I was reading an article recently that this infrastructure is available for as little as $250 a month. They'll send you the credentials via Telegram, fully encrypted. They'll manage it all for you. They'll do all the configuration, and you just send them a fee, and they take care of it for you. But this attack is going to go against an environment of malicious, a legitimate site attacked by a malicious person. They're going to craft a phishing email. They're probably going to use AI tools to make it look really, really convincing. They're going to do their homework against their intended target, and they're going to craft that message in a way that that user is going to click on it. They send that to all your users. Those users who do click on the link, who do provide their credentials, who do MFA like you've trained them to do, their credentials get stolen. Attacker gets credentials. Attacker replays credentials. Attacker gets access to your legitimate site. So which one of these two pages is malicious? I showed this to my mom beforehand. I practiced the presentation with her. She's watching my chocolate lab at home right now. And had her look at this. She got it right on the second time. Ramiro, do you know which one it is?
I think it's the one on the right.
It is.
No, I can see it. I can see the URL now,
yeah.
but
yeah.
I think folks on the back can see it either.
Yeah, it is the one on the right. They look very convincing. But we'll look at an actual attempt here in progress. So on the left side of the screen, this is one of my program managers running a tool called EvilJinx, running it on a VM. And then I am playing the role of Quincy, our employee who probably didn't pass security awareness training, the guy who everyone in security doesn't like and the guy that the attackers really love. He clicks on everything. So Quincy's clicked on a link here. It's sending him to the sign-in page that looks real, looks like what he's used to. Quincy puts his username in. He's prompted for his password here in a second. Quincy puts in his super secret password. It's a really good password. And he's asked to do MFA. He does remember he's supposed to do MFA. Quincy puts in his code that he just got texted to him. And you notice that we see Quincy's username and his password. And there's his SAS token that includes an MFA claim. And the attacker now has everything that they need in order to compromise Quincy's account and then traverse wherever else they want to go. We see Quincy has been signed into Microsoft 365. To him, does not look like there was anything bad that happened. So what are we suggesting that you'd go do? We'd really love to see it if everyone turned on MFA. Even better, we'd really love to see you use stronger authentication methods. So those of you, how many of you are familiar with conditional access? Raise your hands. A few of you. Okay, so conditional access is the policy engine that we use within Microsoft, within Entra, to enforce your organization's security controls. So if you say, I need all of my users to sign in from devices that meet a minimum compliance level, you can enforce that there. You can also say, I want all my users to use phishing-resistant MFA methods.
Right. So one minor point I want to say on top of what John is saying is
Yep.
that when we came here, what, 2-3 years back to talk about conditional access, our message is like turn MFA, right? That prevents 99.99% of the attacks. But then now we have, and this is a thing you will see in this presentation, is we have more tools to respond to that threat landscape. So now we tweak this MFA, just to say MFA, and let the user choose. Now we have this option, and we do recommend that you guys help your customers or your organization to move from MFA to like require this specific kind of MFA, which is more secure.
Yeah, you can control the individual methods that you support. So it might be a passkey, like a FIDO key, or I think almost all of us have a smartphone. You can do a passkey on your phone as well. But these auth strengths, at least start with your admins. At least start there with these stronger credentials, with these phishing-resistant methods. You can control and specify with conditional access exactly which groups of users you want to enforce on. You can also enforce external users to use these methods. We'll talk about that here in a few minutes. So how does this look for a user? So on the left side of the screen, you're going to see a same device authentication. This is a user going to sign into Teams. They click to sign in. They're asked to use their passkey. They validate with their face, and they're signed into Teams. Cross-device, signing in on their Mac. It asks them for their security key. They scan it with their phone, and they're able to sign in a phishing-resistant credential that, as of right now, can't be.
So that will mitigate that attack that we saw with the Nginx proxy.
Yep. Took care of that one. So what else would we like you to do? There's the conditional access gap analyzer workbook. We see in this image, there are 21 users coming from the United States who didn't have a conditional access policy applied to them. We want to try and go and figure out why that is. It'll help us also identify any legacy authentication use. That's a really bad thing. We should get rid of that. Any unprotected applications, high-risk sign-ins, things like that. There's tools like continuous access evaluation and token protection policies that you can also go enable in your environment. These will help you close that gap and protect your credentials even more. And with that, pass it over to Ramiro. Talk about apps.
I have the power now. Right, so the second part that we're seeing is protecting applications. So credentials, we have like put that message through many years, and customers, we've been doing what, 6-7 years, and still not everybody's doing MFA, but the next frontier, especially for us here in the community of pen testing and security professionals, is go after the application. So typically, this is one of the techniques to either go to lateral movement to get even broader access. So one of the things that we're seeing, how many of you are familiar with Auth2? Exactly. So some of these flows basically also require the application itself to authenticate, to get a token on behalf of a user or by itself. And then that's the other very juicy target that sometimes the bad actors go and do. So we have provided a new capability, a new-ish capability called app management policies. It's not as widely used, but we want customers to start using it and essentially give some guidelines, some guardrails about the hygiene of those credentials. So the one that is typically where we see most challenges is in the client credential when there's secrets. That's the easiest one, and this is where most of the examples are because they're easy to just go and replicate or in a tutorial, whatnot. But then the problem with that is that all the inherent problems that we see with the passwords also apply to those applications, right?
It's basically a password.
Typically, exactly. So it's a glorified password. So typically we see cases where the password happens to be in source code or in a file share somewhere or in somebody's email,
that never
which,
happens.
using.
Never happens.
Exactly. So those are vectors that we can start as admins tell, hey, go on, not allow passwords anymore or control the life cycle of those passwords for, let's say, cannot be longer than 30 or 69 days or whatever it is that we want. So that allows to control life cycle or for how long we have the secrets, as well as blocking the secrets altogether, which is what we recommend. And then we keep finding cases. I've been doing this for a while now, and we talk to large customers or smaller, doesn't matter. We always find this lingering app that nobody's using that has a password that hasn't been changed in 10 years. And then you see we did the migration to Exchange back in 2012 or 13 or whatever else, and the password still lingering in and still valid. So this is a tool very important for customers to see. And then alongside that, we also have conditional access, John's favorite, for workload identity. So we're taking conditional access for robots, for those what we call service principals or workload identities. So it's pretty much the same. So for those of you who are familiar with conditional access, basically the same thing, but obviously the filters and the conditions and controls are slightly different. So you can create controls like, for example, if the application is at risk, then block access or generate an alert for your SOC or SIEM system. And also, if your environment is such that exactly, the compute of that application to always be in a particular data center or something, you can narrow down the IP. You can say, hey, it always has to run to these IP ranges. So this is the kind of.
You always work. Your app is supposed to be running in the U.S. Why is your app running in Brazil right now?
Exactly right. So and again, we have been talking about ML and AI. Let's use it for good, right? So we also developed identity. How many of you are familiar with identity protection? Entra ID identity protection. So this is machine learning to derive risk, to calculate risk based on the signal. So we have a lot of signal, as John was mentioning, and we can craft some specific heuristics to calculate some of this risk. So what examples that we have here is the application is doing suspicious sign-in, so things that they didn't do out of the normal. So that will calculate the risk that you can create policy saying, hey, if the risk goes medium or high, then block the application or whatever else. So we have a number. We literally have to, and I thank you folks from the back to give us the flexibility to update the slides, because we literally rolled out 2 more signals by the time we create the slides and today. So we had to refresh this slide to add more. And this is just a call out for us to rely on those signals. You have to define the policy once, but then the detections keep evolving over time. So we added the last couple suspicious sign-ins or unusual addition of credentials over time. So these are very important. One that is very cool and I'm pretty sure will find dividends, and you can actually demo it, is leak credentials, right? So the credentials, we have signals to go out and scan GitHub and similar. If we find that secret of your app, then we will flag that up as at risk. All right, let's keep going here since we have limited time. Other vector is the consent. So sometimes it's just a evil application that looks a lot like SharePoint, or SharePoint with a Turkish eye or a 0 or whatever else, and the users, with the techniques that John was saying, a malicious email or something, they lure the user into clicking on that link, and the application looks very similar. It says SharePoint, and then you kind of click on it, and then you ended up consenting. So you can create guardrails for your users to control the consent. So a couple of tools in the toolkit here. First is control whether the users can do consent or not. We are in the security side, so we are always hardcore block it and then have the users to go to the help desk. There's another option, which is, hey, only allow for low permissions, for example, the user sign in. If that is a lower risk permission, then you can allow it. And you can also say, allow it only for Microsoft verified publishers. So if we have an ecosystem of vendors of software, then we can create that reputation and say, hey, only well-known vetted applications can have that. Typical case is like plugins and emails and stuff like that, like Boomerang or similar, that are well-known to help people to be productive in the email and such. You can create that or create additional policies. So this is just the UI friendly, but there's a very rich policy model to say, hey, for this resource, for let's say you create your own app, or for Microsoft Graph, anything related to, I don't know, Teams chat, then allow these 3 applications, otherwise block. And you can create a lot of regions about consent on that policies. And then lastly,
trying to find a balance of friction between
exactly
lock it way down, turn security up to 11 and 0, and letting users to do it.
So you have that flexibility to say, hey, productivity to a certain degree, some other riskier permissions, you can decide to put either a workflow approval or block it altogether. And that's the third recommendation, is to just enable those approval workflows for those riskier. And now, this is the slide that it's not a feature necessarily, but it's very important. And I think that of all cohorts that we go and talk to, this is probably the one that you folks are more familiar with, and we see in the basics of security is create an inventory. I think our colleague earlier was talking about injection of DLLs and things like that. How do you know how many applications may be vulnerable to something? We had that log4j, for example. So this is why it's very important to have an inventory. And typically what we recommend is having at least these few things in the slide. Owners of the application from the business as well as technical side, in case that we need to contact them to do a change, roll over a secret. For example, if we find that, hey, you have a password in your source code, go and change it. Also, seasonality, that's very important. Some applications, for example, we are in our
open enrollment
of benefits, but it's only between October and November. Anything beyond that, we can have either a strategy to disable it or to create extra monitoring until after the season of the application starts, that kind of thing. So that's very important to have that. Also, the technical aspects. So what is the authentication flow? So if we find something different from those flows that we expect, then create monitoring and so on. So it's very important that, especially in this when you guys have an engagement with your customers, ask them, hey, where's your inventory of applications? And then start from there. And if not, then encourage your users to have that. Now, let's talk about another area, which is external access. So that's the next frontier, right? So with Entra and modern SaaS, we enable collaboration between users. So if John was in another company and I am Microsoft, I can share with him a document, or we can collaborate in Teams or whatever else. So what is the tool in the toolkit there? The first thing is with the lifecycle. Onboarding. How many of you are familiar with Entra Verified ID? Not many of us. How about decentralized identity? More or less? Okay, so just, we don't have a ton of time, but essentially, this is a mechanism to allow a decentralized way to validate assertions about subjects, so in this case, human beings. So if, for example, if I want to verify that John is a US citizen, before I share something or let him into the SharePoint side, then this platform allows me to create that fabric of trust. For example, with IDEMIA or LexisNexis or similar identity providers, or not identity verification services, we can say, hey, go to LexisNexis, verify that you're a US citizen, and then that generates an assertion, and then that assertion I can verify. So you can use those advanced onboarding techniques for guests, or even for your employees for some of these capabilities. So that's another tool in the toolkit. And one of the cool things is that you can also have like liveness checks. So for example, if I expect, like our physical badges, we have a picture ourselves. So imagine this digital version where, hey, I'm going to present this verifiable credential that has a picture on it, and then I have to take a selfie and compare that it's the same person. So all of that, there's a lot of, and you guys, we can send you some pointers at, offline, but that's another way to like step up, literally, the onboarding of your users. Especially the guests, where you don't necessarily control. Now, other thing is restrict guest permissions. And this is one pattern that we want to emphasize, is that as we evolve Entra, we keep refining the permission sets for different areas. So we encourage customers to stay, you don't like, security posture is not always static, right? Every so often you have to recommend to kind of revisit your decision. So in this case, we have this, what the guests can do. So in the past, we have our limited set of permissions, but then we create a new, more restricted set of permissions that only allow the guest to see himself and the things that the groups that he's a member of, he or she's a member of. We recommend exploring getting that, cut back those permissions for guests. One of the main reasons is, again, you don't control that other entity. So if that other entity has like loosey-goosey security practices or whatever else, then you will be able to at least contain the impact of that.
We've never seen that happen. We've never seen all guests can behave exactly like a member of your tenant.
Yeah, we did see a customer that was basically, for convenience, they say, oh, guests have the same permissions as members. And then they had so many guests that, hey, do you know like where this guy is coming from? Whoops, no, you don't. Okay, cool. So that's one, restrict guest permissions. And then the other is, and this is very important, is when you folks start an engagement with a customer, first thing that I recommend is go and see the guests. I guarantee you that at least 30, well, not guarantee you. Are we recording? No. But it's very likely that a big chunk, let's say between 30 and 40% of guests don't log in, are not active anymore. So you can kick them out.
Like you said, that SharePoint migration earlier, Exchange
reduce
migration
risk,
earlier.
exactly. So, hey, 5 years ago, I sent a link to a colleague in a campaign, a marketing campaign that we collaborated for a product that was launched 5 years ago, and the person's still lingering in the environment. So you can use access reviews to basically say, hey, let's take all the groups where I have guests and see if those guests require permission or not. So we can appoint an owner to go and say, hey, these 10 guests, 3 have permissions, the other 5 don't have permission. We just need to kick them out, or to use ML to recommend, hey, based on an activity, this user has to be kicked out. So this is a tool to clean those guests on a regular basis. And this is a good tool for those organic growth that patterns where you have a user that invites another user on basically organically. There's another flavor of collaboration, which is called entitlement management, which is basically based on business roles. So for example, if you have a supply chain, what your vendors will typically have access to the invoice app, some reports, and perhaps a SharePoint site. So that business role, you can encapsulate the resources and then create policies to onboard that user to that business role. So if that user is external, you can create policies and say, hey, this business role is applicable only to these 5 to 10 organizations. And then they need to only be valid for, let's say, 3 months. And then after 3 months, they need to reapply, or they just kick them out, and so on. So this is very important with entitlement management for that kind of collaboration. And more importantly, the state is tracked. So if the person, let's say, loses access to the business role due to, I don't know, lapsed 3 months, then this system tracks them and say, hey, this guest has 0 business roles, therefore we can kick them out automatically. So least privilege starts with not having the account in the first place. So now, John is going to talk a little bit more on the correct authentication side at the runtime.
So we talked about conditional access earlier, and we said we want you to move to those phishing resistant credentials. It's important that if you are moving in that direction, and if you have these connected organizations that you trust, that you come in and set your MFA trust settings. You can change what you allow. You can accept this for all organizations or for specific organizations. Ramiro was talking about an inventory. With these external collaboration settings, it's good to have an inventory of those as well to know here are the organizations that we trust, and we've enabled these settings for them. You can trust their MFA claim. So whatever MFA claim they provide, you can trust that. This will allow you to use those phishing resistant methods. You could also trust that their device compliance policies make sense to you, or that their hybrid join policy exists and is correct based on what you want. Additionally, we talked about you can target these external users with phishing resistant methods, but there's a specific way that you can target just those external users, and you can set specific policies only for those users. Terms of use is one that we see frequently get used here, or network location. Hey, we want this contract company to only work on-prem when they're here doing their contract work. We don't want them to have access to this outside of this trusted network location boundary. Again, here's those phishing resistant methods. If you do or don't enable those trust settings, you can or can't use specific methods when you set this up. So please go in and check those settings if you are using external access, if you've got vendors or contractors who have access to your environment. And then with that, we've got a couple of go-dos.
Right, homework for us.
So we talked about protecting our credentials. We want you to go and enable those phishing resistant methods and use the gap analyzer workbook. If there's two things you go do, I would really love to see more conditional access adoption, and that gap analyzer workbook. A lot of customers find really good value in that.
Yeah, now this is an interesting group, right? So recommendation is to protect if you're in the defensive side, but if you are going to do like the red teaming, this is an area that we want you to kind of poke around and share to your findings to customers, so especially the phishing resistant. We need to make sure customers really understand and move away from those phishable methods to methods that are stronger.
And when you have moved, go ahead and turn off the old ones.
Right.
If you're done with your migration, there's no reason to keep SMS messaging around anymore.
Exactly. On the protect applications, in this case, it's protect and attack, I guess. So try to move away from secrets to certificates and manage identities. So we didn't spend a ton of time manage identities, but essentially is if you run an application, let's say in an Azure website or a Logic app, that resource can act as itself, and then Entra and Azure manage the identity under the cover. So it's basically a certificate, but it's automatically managed. So when we tear down the VM or the whatever Azure resource, that managed identity also disappears. So use that resource when appropriate. The other is start using conditional access for workloads. So that includes identity protection findings. And finally, as I mentioned before, consent is another vector for bad actors to go after and try to phish users. So define those consent policies to basically minimize that vector of consent. So there's we have some documentation to help customers to find the footprint of the consent that's already there. We have another, if you guys want to go and look at it, we have an Azure AD assessment that runs a script that shows, hey, here are the list of applications that users have consented. I'm pretty sure you will find very interesting insights when you run it. We keep finding that. We've been doing this for 7 years now, and we keep finding stuff on the consent side. And then lastly, external users.
Yeah, so restrict those guest user permissions. Do you really want guests to be able to behave as if they're just a regular user in your environment? Or do you want to shrink down that permission set? What organizations do you actually trust? Do you have a working relationship with them? and manage that guest lifecycle. Ramiro mentioned it, the inventory aspect applies across all of this. Knowing what you have is half the battle. And then on top of all this, the things that we shared in here are part of a bigger assessment, Ramiro said, and a bigger set of content that we are actively working on. So we'd love to hear feedback from all of you on things that you may think we should do better at, or we should document better. I work on the documentation team, and so all of this content will eventually be available on learn.microsoft.com.
Yeah, you guys have a little tidbit, a preview of how we want to share the broader guidance. And this is just the top 3 areas where we see emerging patterns that are, more noticeable. But there's a ton more in Entra. So, I was just talking with a colleague here before lunch. Entra, if you have Office 365 or your customers have Office 365, they have Entra. So all this is applicable, and then there's a lot of opportunities to go on and improve the security for our customers. And with that, I think we are ready for some questions, maybe. So thank you so much for the time.